Welcome friends to this video that I'm making in which I will be explaining the true meaning of Paulo Coelho's The Alchemist to you. My name is Karen Williams and The Alchemist happened to me in real life. That might sound very strange, but in actual fact this is something which people call life imitating art. In the 33 years since The Alchemist's publication, The Alchemist has always been considered a work of fiction, but in actual fact it is not. It is partially true, and that is because it predicted the future, and that future then happened to me. I'd like to show you a picture of myself with Paulo Coelho in Santiago de Compostela. I had met Paulo before in person in The Hague in 2004, but by 2008 I had decided to give him absolutely everything I knew about The Alchemist, and so I wrote a handwritten book and gave it to him in Santiago, and I explained the fundamentals of the story. I explained to him that in fact he had never written The Alchemist, that he had channeled it, and that he had predicted the future, and the future happened to me. I also told him that it was a story about man's search for the redemption of the shadow. It was a journey of redemption. I also told Paulo that it was a story of two heroes and not one. Santiago was not the only hero in the book. There were two, so there were two dreams, two heroes, and two treasures. So by 2008, Paulo knew all of this from me, but unfortunately he decided to ignore me. Now let's go to a video and I will show it to you here. And in this video you will see Paulo is being interviewed by Oprah Winfrey. If I can just get to the section I'm looking for. This is the section. Now, this was 6 years after Paulo and I met in Santiago de Compostela. And in this interview, Paulo throws Oprah a curved ball. He makes a confession which is rather surprising, and I'd like you to listen to it.
The prophecy is quite difficult to explain, but Oprah, you want to know, did I write The Alchemist? I'm not sure. I'm sure that I was a good instrument.
So there you have it. Paulo is confessing to Oprah that, did I write The Alchemist? I'm not sure. Well, this is probably the most important thing that Paulo has ever said to the readers of The Alchemist in the entire time in which it has been published. He speculated, did I write The Alchemist? I'm not sure. Well, in fact, he knew that he had actually channeled the story, and he also knew that it happened to somebody in real life, and that person was me. Now, I'd like to give you an example of life imitating art. Here you have a photograph of a man called Morgan Robertson. Morgan Robertson wrote a novel in 1898 called Futility. He later named it The Wreck of the Titan. But in the novel he describes the story of a huge ship that was built, which was called Titan. It was the largest of its kind at that time. And on its maiden voyage in the North Atlantic, it sank because it hit an iceberg. Most of the people on board were killed because there weren't enough lifeboats on the ship. Little did Mr. Robertson know that 14 years later, a real-life event which would occur, which was something that he had predicted in his novel. In other words, in 1912, the Titanic sank on its maiden voyage in the North Atlantic because it hit an iceberg, exactly as his ship, the Titan, in his novel did. And most of the people perished because there weren't enough lifeboats on the ship. So here we have an example of a novel, or a supposed novel, predicting the future, and that future coming true many years later. Well, in my case, The Alchemist was published in 1988, but I started to live out the main events of The Alchemist 7 years after it was published. So now let me show you exactly how this happened. If you'll excuse me, I'll just put this up on the computer screen. Now, here you see the photograph of myself and Paulo yet again in Santiago de Compostela. And I have split the photograph into two halves. And in this first half, we will examine what the plot of The Alchemist is. So here we have it. This is the plot of The Alchemist. It tells the story of the shepherd Santiago, who lives in Andalusia. He lives in a town where there is a Moorish fortress on the top of a hill, and foreigners come to visit the fortress and visit the town. One night, Santiago has a dream inside a ruined church, and this dream comes to him for a second time. It is a dream in which he is told that he will find treasure if he journeys to the pyramids of Egypt. Having had that dream, Santiago goes to Tarifa and to Tangiers. He goes to Tarifa and sells all his sheep, and then crosses the Straits of Gibraltar and arrives in Tangiers. There he loses all his money and works for a crystal merchant for a year. After having saved enough money, Santiago joins a caravan train and crosses the desert, the Sahara Desert, to go to the pyramids of Egypt. Once he arrives at the pyramids, he starts digging for his treasure in a dune overlooking the pyramids. He digs and digs and digs, but finds nothing. He is apprehended there by a band of robbers, and they see that he has gold on him, so they force him to continue digging. But after hours and hours of digging, no gold appears in the hole. With that, the robbers decide to beat him to within an inch of his life. They beat him, and in that beating, Santiago experiences death very close to him. And in that moment, he has a kind of epiphany, a subconscious realization that this madness of looking for treasure in a hole is not really his treasure, that his treasure, in fact, is his own precious life. In that moment, he confesses his dream to the leader of the refugees who are beating him, and that leader scoffs at Santiago and tells him that he too was a dreamer, and he had dreams. In fact, he had had 2 dreams exactly where they were on top of the dune, and he had dreamed that he would find treasure in a ruined church in Andalusia. So that's the plot of The Alchemist, the main points. Now let's see what happened on my journey. Well, on my journey, I too, like Santiago, lived in Andalusia, and in fact the town which was nearby to where I lived had an old Moorish fortress on the top of a hill, and people from other countries would come to visit the town and also the Moorish fortress. One night I had an incredible dream after visiting my favourite ruin, which stood on a hill nearby my parents' house. When I had that dream took me to Tarifa, just like Santiago. I didn't have any sheep to sell, but I went to Tarifa. Then I crossed the Straits of Gibraltar and went to Tangiers. I stayed there for a short while, and then I embarked on a journey through a metaphorical desert. I crossed that desert and found myself in a land of pyramids. In the case of Santiago, the pyramids were the Egyptian pyramids at the other side of the Sahara Desert. In my case, the pyramids were in Paris. the pyramids which stand in the Louvre Museum courtyard. Then, like Santiago, I started to dig a hole, except that my hole was a metaphorical hole. I was digging for metaphorical treasure. And in my hole, I found absolutely nothing. And in a sense, the man who encouraged me to keep on digging my hole was giving me a beating, because he was continually forcing me in a way to keep on digging in my hole. Whilst I was digging and feeling quite dead inside, which was very similar to Santiago. Santiago felt that death was very close to him, but I felt like I was actually metaphorically dead. And in that moment, I experienced an epiphany, and I realized that this metaphorical digging I was doing was not giving me any treasure, that in fact, my treasure was my life, my precious life, and all the people I loved. So I abandoned that digging. And when I did that and abandoned the search for my treasure, I received that treasure from the man who forced me into that digging and was giving me the beating. So I'd just like you to look at those coincidences between the alchemist and myself. And also, if you can remember how Morgan Robertson's book, Futility, predicted the sinking of the Titanic. And here you have an example of life imitating art. Paulo channeled the alchemist, and then the alchemist happened to me in real life. So I'm just going to close the flaps of this photograph of myself and Paulo. And now I'm going to show you where the alchemist actually started. This is an illustration I have made of where the alchemist started for me. This is Andalusia, and it's a real place. And I shall just show you where I used to live with my parents. I lived in this house in the countryside in Andalusia, and on a hill near to my parents' house was the ruin I mentioned, which I went to, and when I left it and went back to my parents' house, I had my astonishing dream, which took me to Tarifa and Tangiers. Now, this is the town which was close by to where I lived, and this town had a Moorish fortress on a hill which people used to visit. And right at the top of the mountain side, there was a village. And as you can see, this is the mountain, or rather the Sierra, where I lived. Now, this is Andalusia. Now, what you will see in this picture is that in actual fact, you will notice that the mountains at the top of the picture almost form perfect pyramids. And when I left my parents' house to go to Tarifa and Tangiers, and then journey into a metaphorical desert, and then go to a land of pyramids, which was in fact Paris, I had never noticed that the mountains in the Sierra were almost like perfect pyramids. Now, this picture is full of signs, because in actual fact, there is a very important sign down here in the town. You will see these three buildings, and on the top of them, they have three pyramids. Now, this in actual fact is a hotel in the town where I live, near the town where I lived, and the hotel is called Hotel Las Piramides, or Hotel the Pyramids. So in actual fact, where my journey began, there were pyramids. The mountains were the pyramids, and the hotel had three pyramids on its roof and was called the Hotel Pyramids. So I'd just like to take that away from you now, so that you know there was actually a real location for the alchemist. And I'd like to go to this quotation from Paulo Coelho. You have to take risks. You will only understand the miracle of life fully when we allow the unexpected to happen. Well, that's exactly what I did. I took enormous risks. In fact, my spiritual journey, which was a carbon copy of The Alchemist, nearly killed me. And what I discovered was that The Alchemist was a story of redemption. Sorry, I'm just going to make that a bit more secure so it doesn't fall over. What I discovered was that the journey I had taken was a journey in search of an encounter with the shadow of my ego. And in the book, Santiago does exactly the same. Most people think that the journey is actually what the book is all about, but in fact, it is not. The story of The Alchemist, the really important part of The Alchemist, is right at the end of the book. It is when Santiago receives his beating from the robbers led by the leader of the refugees. And why is this the most important part of the story? Because this is the part of the story where Santiago confronts his shadow, his ego. Now, the shadow is all the negative aspects of ourselves, including the ego. It is our selfishness, it is our meanness, it is our anger, it is our sexual passions, it is our addictions, it is all the parts of us that are selfish and disgusting to us. Well, Santiago has an obsession, and his ego's obsession is that he find this treasure in the dune, and he has it for himself and only for himself. And when he is beaten by the robbers, in actual fact, this is a metaphor for him encountering the shadow of his ego. He encounters an external manifestation of the shadow of himself or his ego in the form of the men and the leader who beat him, because they too are obsessed with finding gold and finding treasure. So Santiago is beaten by his own shadow, by his own ego obsession for the treasure. And it is only when he reaches a point where he is staring death in the face that he finally gives up and lets go of his ego's obsession. And when he lets go of it, he confesses his dream to the leader of the refugees. And it is in that moment of letting go that it is possible for him to receive his true treasure. Now, the reason that The Alchemist is a story of two heroes is that the leader of the refugees is also looking for the redemption of his own shadow. And when he is beating Santiago to the point of death, he is expressing his own shadow in that beating. So when Santiago abandons his ego's desire for his treasure and confesses his dream, the leader of the refugees is able to tell Santiago where the location of his true treasure is, which is in the ruined church in Andalusia. Now, I have written a book called Anwar's Story, and Anwar's story is the story of the other hero in The Alchemist. And here it is. Anwar is the name I gave to the leader of the refugees because he too is looking for the redemption of his shadow. And Anwar's story explains to you how he achieves that redemption, which is something that Paulo never wrote about in his book. Now, I am offering a free PDF of Anwar's story to anybody who is interested in knowing how The Alchemist is actually a story of two heroes. So that particular free PDF is on my video called Coelho'S The Alchemist, The True Meaning, Part 3. So if you go to that video, Coelho'S The Alchemist, The True Meaning, Part 3, you will find a free PDF of Anwar's story, which explains how The Alchemist happened to me in real life and how it is actually a story of two heroes, two dreams, and two treasures. And it is the story of a universal story of man's search for redemption. Thank you very much, everybody.